Oh, good morning. I like to do an informational reading, and I actually did a study in Gettysburg for a week on the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg. So, because I have quite a bit of knowledge about that, I like to share that with my students. And so, I want to talk today to you about the Gettysburg Address. So you might have seen it written on or handwritten on like parchment paper. This is, of course, not the real thing. Actually, it's kind of interesting. There are 5 different copies of the Gettysburg Address. When Lincoln first wrote the Gettysburg Address, well, I'll talk about that with you later, but he had one that he gave at the speech from. And of course, when you're doing a speech, you don't read it word for word because you're looking at the audience. So there was somebody there who took down shorthand. It's an old way of taking notes and taking down everything he said. So there was the original speech that he read from. There was the guy that copied down what he said and printed that the next day in the New York Times. And that's exactly what he said. And then there are other copies where people would say, hey, would you send us a copy of the Gettysburg Address? And so he hand wrote these. So at one time, there were like 4 or 5 handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address signed by Lincoln. But I don't know how many are still around. If you have one, it's probably worth a lot of money. So the background for the Gettysburg Address. 2.5 minutes long, 272 words, and he was asked to do a few appropriate remarks, but these are a few appropriate remarks never to be forgotten. So there's much to be learned about the Civil War, its battles, its people, its causes, but this is about the Gettysburg Address that was delivered November 19th, 1863. So, what made these 272 words great? How did he say everything he needed to say in less than 3 minutes? And why are we still talking about it today? So the setting was Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg was a horrible, horrible battle where tens of thousands of people were killed on both sides. The battle really was kind of just a coincidence that it happened in Gettysburg. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, but it's right on the Maryland border. And there are actually 10 roads that go into Gettysburg. So Robert E. Lee had been feeling, they had won their battles in the South, and he said, I think that the North has more resources than we do, and if we're going to win this war, we need to get it into the North so the people will say, we don't want this fighting, in our towns, and they thought that the North would give up. So he headed up to Harrisburg, where there was a big terminal. The story is they needed shoes. I don't know. I think they needed supplies, and there was a big supply depot in Harrisburg, so they were heading there. But they accidentally ran into some Union soldiers on the way, and then the Union knew that Lee's entire army was marching into Pennsylvania. And so that's actually why the battle ended up happening in Gettysburg. If we had more time, I would take you through that. You'll probably get that with Mr. Withrow next year. But till the first day, if Lee had pursued the Union Army, Gettysburg probably would have been won by the South. And we would be 2 nations right now. But Lee decided not to pursue, and that gave the Union Army time to settle on Cemetery Hill. And so they had a good, being on top of a hill always gives you a better strategy for fighting. And they were able to get reinforcements. And eventually, after the 3rd day of fighting, the Union was able to win. This is considered the turning point of the Civil War because even though the war went on for 2 more years, there were no battles in the North after this. So Lincoln came into Gettysburg, and the Battle of Gettysburg happened in July, but it was still rather devastating. The people of Gettysburg is a small town, probably about the size maybe Richwood or something, and so the people of Gettysburg had to take care of all these dead bodies and all these injured soldiers, and it had been not a very pretty place. So July 1, 2, and 3, I guess I got ahead of myself. Some of the greatest, deadliest series of battles of Civil War were fought in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There were 3,100 Union soldiers killed, 14,000 wounded, and 5,300 captured or missing. A lot of those guys that were captured, as you learned in Pink and Say, like the prison in Andersonville and stuff, they did not have good facilities for these soldiers to live in. A lot of soldiers just died in prison too. The Confederates lost 1,000 more, about 1,500 more, I guess. Soldiers didn't have quite as many wounded. I guess their guys died. And then they had 5,800 that were captured. But I think the thing about the Civil War is they were all Americans because it was Americans against Americans. So 5 months after the battles, the National Cemetery at Gettysburg was to be dedicated. And the president, because he was the president, was invited. And so here was the invitation he got. It is the desire that after the oration, you, as chief executive of the nation, formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use for a few appropriate remarks. So this dude, Edward Everett, he was a famous speaker, and he spoke for over 2 hours using 13,000 words. And if you look at this baby, that's how I would have felt probably after about half an hour. I'm not very good at sitting and listening to people talk. But anyhow, so he was the main speaker. And then it was time for Lincoln to have a few appropriate remarks. Now, there's a click here. I don't know if you can get to it from here. I put a URL on. And this is a really cool video of the Gettysburg Address. I've probably listened to it 15 or 20 times, and I still enjoy listening to it. So make sure you go to that URL and listen to this presentation of the Gettysburg Address. So, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are equal. So, 87 years ago would have been the Declaration of Independence, where they declared themselves separate from England. Of course, they had to fight to get that. All men are created equal would be the slavery reference, which comes from the Declaration of Independence. And Lincoln uses this quote because he knows that there is a slavery issue. Actually, the people in Gettysburg were pretty abolitionists or against slavery. There was a whole Black community that lived there. Maryland was actually a slave state. So right across the border, there was a community of African Americans there. So he uses this quote. This would have been familiar, and it would have been a reference to the slave issue. So that was talking about the past. Now the present. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived, so dedicated, can long endure. The United States and the way we governed was called the Great Experiment. Nobody had ever set up the type of government by the people, of the people, for the people like this. There have always been dictators. And even when the United States set up, they thought, well, George Washington's going to be our king. And he says, no. And so the government was set up with checks and balances between the three parts of the government. So what are they there for? To dedicate the portion of the field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives, that this nation might live. And it's fitting that we should do that. So he presented the problem of the Civil War, The test was, can our nation stand together? The occasion was the dedication of the field. The mood was somber. A lot of people had died. And his purpose was to dedicate it and give a tribute to the men. But a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The main brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. So he honors the dead by putting their sacrifice above him, and he was the president. So that would be his humility there. And then he says that nobody's going to remember what we say here, just remember what the soldiers did here. And we know the irony of that statement because we're still talking about what he said there today. So it's for the living rather to be dedicated. Now, what are we supposed to do about all this? So he has the past, he has the present, and now the future. It's for us to finish to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It's rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remain before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last measure of devotion. In other words, they died. That we highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So he challenges his audience, says, these people died. So what is our job? Our job is to finish their work. And the of the people, by the people, for the people comes from, wow, I got to remember. This was actually, he is credited for saying this, but there are other people that said this before him. He just kind of made it his own. And so lots of times this is credited to Lincoln. So, and why did he include this? Because it is important that our government, the great experiment is from the people, by the people, for the people, not for a bunch of rich people or a rich king to rule. So that's a pretty good idea about the meaning of the Gettysburg Address. I'm going to stop there because this is getting long, and I want you to listen to the link to the Gettysburg Address, and then I'll do a second one for you.